Hi everybody, welcome to our lecture today on ethics. With regard to today's lecture, we're just going to be focusing on a certain aspect of ethics for our organizational behavior class. What we're going to be looking at primarily is helping you to manage your employees. Now, when you start to become a manager or executive in business, you're going to have a number of employees, and you'll probably enter into that with your own set of ethics. And you'll probably have expectations that your employees who report to you will follow that set of ethics that you have. The unfortunate thing is, as good as your employees may be, and as good as you've communicated things to them, the odds are that at least some of your employees, maybe even you on occasion, will probably step outside the rules and guidelines you have for ethics. So how are you going to manage them when they do? So what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at probably four major topics. We're going to have an introduction talking about ethical awareness and judgment. Then we're going to move to the major portion of today's lecture, and we're going to be talking about moral disengagement. Moral disengagement. These are the reasons your employee will give to you why he or she thinks that some sort of unethical action is justified. It's fine. Yes, it was wrong, but it's still fine. And then what we'll do is we'll turn to some barriers to to having good ethical judgment, and then we'll also take a look at just some other considerations that you have. So let's go ahead. Let's get started with this. Let's start off with the introduction. And the introduction talks about ethical awareness and judgment, and there are 2 points I want to raise here for you. The first point's a rule, and the second talks about influences. Well, let's take a look at the rule. The rule is that your ethically related actions are influenced, if not determined by, your ethical judgment, which in turn is influenced or determined by your ethical awareness, Notice 3 key words that I used there: actions, judgment, and awareness. Again, your ethically related actions are influenced, if not determined by, your ethical judgment, which in turn is influenced or determined by your ethical awareness. Basically what this is saying, what this rule is saying, you can read it backwards basically, is that if indeed you want to have ethical actions by your employees, what's going to impact them first is their ethical awareness. That's going to lead them to their ethical judgment, and that's going to lead them to their ethical actions, ethical or unethical, as they go through here. So a key point here is if you want to have your employees act in an ethical way, you have to make them ethically aware. Let me give you an example here with regard to ethical awareness. When you go to the store, let's say that you go to Walmart. Usually when you enter Walmart, the first thing you see besides shopping carts and some stuff that they're trying to sell, maybe some seasonal stuff or whatever, the first thing you really see as you enter the store is you usually see a greeter. Most Walmarts have a greeter. And you can ask yourself, well, why do they have a greeter? Why do they have, some old person like Fogarty at the door saying, "Welcome to Walmart"? Well, it's not necessarily because they care that you're there. It's not really because they want to welcome you. Oh, we haven't seen you in so long. Welcome back, etc. One of the main reasons they do it is studies have shown that stores that have greeters can cut back significantly on shoplifting. And Walmart's tried it out, and it's worked for Walmart. So they have those greeters there because they think it will cut back on shoplifting, and certainly an unethical activity. Well, how is this related to this rule? Well, what they're trying to do is from the moment you enter Walmart is they want to let you know, we're watching you. We're here, we know you're here, welcome aboard, nice to have you here, but we're watching you from the moment you come into our store. By doing that, they're making you aware, right as you're getting there, oh my goodness, someone's going to be watching me. I maybe should be aware of my P's and Q's as I go through here. Maybe I should be ethically aware. So what they're trying to do is if they make you aware when you walk through the door, hopefully your judgment will be ethical, hopefully your actions will be ethical. So they're kind of following this rule with regard to having a greeter at the door. Well, let's go to the second topic that I have under this introduction about ethical awareness and judgment. What influences your ethical awareness? What influences your ethical awareness? So if you think about it, if awareness is that important, how can we make people more aware? How can we make our employees more aware? Well, the textbook mentions that there probably are 3 things that influence your ethical awareness. I would argue that there's probably far more, but these 3 are pretty good. These 3 will certainly get you started. Let's take a look at the 3. The first thing they said with regard to what influences your ethical awareness, your peers. Your peers. Group actions will influence you. Group thoughts, group words, etc. will influence you with regard to your ethical awareness. I mean, think about this. How often have you gone out with a group of people and you have acted differently within the group than you would if you were on your own? For example, if the group gets wild and crazy, even if you're somewhat reserved, etc., even if you don't want to do, wouldn't normally do whatever action or activity they're going to do, because they're getting wild and crazy, you might get wild and crazy too. So your peers certainly influence your ethical awareness. Let me give you an example of that that occurred to me. I hope I'm an ethical person, but like everybody, I have my faults, and I'm sure I've crossed the line on many occasions. Let me give you an example of where I have crossed the line with regard to ethics. When I was going through college, I had to work my way through it. I mean, my parents were great and paid a good portion of it, but I also had to pay off a large portion of it myself. And the way I did that is I was an assistant manager at a movie theater, one of those theaters with lots of different screens, etc., fairly big theater, etc. And one of my first days there, when I got there, I didn't take a snack with me. And I got hungry. Frankly, I have a sweet tooth. I'm kind of a chocoholic. I like chocolate. So after being there for some time, I was getting hungry. I went up to the concession stand. I mean, everybody else buys stuff from the concession stand. Why shouldn't I? Of course, you get to a movie concession stand, they charge you $5 for a chiclet or something like that. So they charge you a lot of money for it. But I get up there and I'm looking through the candy case. Again, I'm looking for something that's easy to eat and chocolatey, sugar, chocolate, etc. And one of the young ladies working behind concession, she looked at me and she said, Mr. Fogarty, what would you like? And I said, I'd like, 3 Musketeer bar or something. And she goes and reaches for it. I reach for my wallet to give her the money, and she goes, "Oh, well, you don't have to pay." So what do you mean I don't have to pay? I mean, I have an idea of what benefits I have in this position. Basically, none. It's a part-time hourly job, etc. So I don't have the benefit of free food. And she said, "Oh, no." She said, "That's not what we do here." She said, "As you can understand, these candy bars, etc. They come wrapped. If they fall on the floor, the candy bar itself doesn't hit the floor, it doesn't get the dirt of the floor, but the outside packaging does. And even though the candy bar is fine, we can't sell it. As soon as it hits the floor, we can't sell it. We're supposed to throw it away. But what we do is we just eat it. Why throw it away? It's good food, etc." And she said, "You said you wanted a 3 Musketeer bar." I said, "Yes." And she reaches into the case and she starts to pull the candy bar to the front, and she makes sure that it falls on the floor, and she hands it to me, and she said, "See, that's what I mean. You never have to pay for any food here." Now, think about that. That's certainly unethical, right? I mean, I shouldn't have, taken the candy bar. She said, "Oh my goodness, young lady, we can't do this," etc. But I didn't do that. What I ate the damn thing. Now, was that ethical? No, it wasn't. But why did I eat it? Well, amongst other things, I ate it because all the other people there were doing that. That was part of the culture of the organization. That was what the peers did. So one of the things you want to be careful about as a manager and leader of an organization is take a look at the culture. What are the people doing? What type of ethical standards do they have? What do they talk about? Are they knocking, Hershey bars on the floor? Or are they, following the rules, etc.? So one of the first things that influences your ethical awareness, your peers. Another thing that influences your ethical awareness is ethical judgment used? Is ethical judgment used? I'm sorry, I said judgment. Is ethical language used? Is ethical language used? If you think about it, from our earlier topics in OB, we talked about communication, we talked about zaps and saps, and we talked about the importance of, watch what you say. And one of the things you probably want to use in a workplace is you want to use language that indicates to people that you follow a certain ethical standard and you expect everybody to act ethically, etc. Let me give you an example of where that didn't happen. There was a movie, I believe, in the 1970s that had a movie star that some of you might have heard his name, Paul Newman. was a movie called The Verdict. You know, if you go to court, you go to a criminal trial, you know, after the jury makes a decision, the judge renders a verdict. You know, are you guilty or are you innocent? And this movie was called The Verdict. And in The Verdict, Paul Newman played an attorney who was representing a lady who had some difficulties, medical difficulties in hospital, and she filed a malpractice case against the hospital. So her attorney was Paul Newman. Paul Newman was on his own. He was basically alone. There was another attorney, an older attorney, who helped him on occasion, etc., but wasn't part of his firm. So as Paul Newman files a lawsuit, etc., against the hospital, of course, the hospital has a huge law firm with, you know, hundreds of people and lots of money. You know, I think even the poorest person in the law firm is, you know, driving a Mercedes, you know, etc. So there's Paul Newman going up against, you know, this giant, etc. Well, where this scene comes into play, where we're talking about ethical language, there is a scene in there where the managing partner, today's managing partner of this large law firm, is paying a new attorney who just started there, a young lady, paying her off for doing something unethical. And she's crying. She's not happy that she did this unethical deed, and she's upset, and he's trying to, you know, he's writing her a check, etc., you know, for doing it. And he's trying to tell her, you know, oh, you don't have to cry for doing something unethical. And he tells us the following story. He said that when he had his first case, his first trial, 20 years ago, or whenever it was, when he came back from the courtroom, as he was coming into the office, the managing attorney way back then for the firm was waiting for him at the door to the law firm. And, you know, he was a little concerned about that. He thought he did an okay job, you know, in his first case. First cases are never easy for any attorney, even if you're, you know, at heart a great attorney. The first case is always difficult. He thought he did a pretty good job. And as he approaches this attorney, the managing attorney, who is referred to, his name was Mr. White, and he was old, so they referred to him as Old Man White. Old Man White was waiting for him at the door. He said, I got a little concerned, etc. And Old Man White said, well, how'd you do? And he said, I replied, well, I did my best. And Old Man White responded, you're not paid to do your best. You're paid to win. Now, I want you to think about what Old Man White said there. What does his ethical language say? Does his ethical language say, hey, ethics are important to us. We want everybody to follow a certain code, and we expect you to act ethically here? Well, of course not. His language is basically saying we want you to get things done. We don't care if you cut corners or whatever. We want you to get it done. So here's a good example of is ethical language used. If it's not used, you could find yourself in a situation where your employees don't think ethics are all that important. If they're important to you, mention it. Use language showing that you believe in ethics. Well, let's go to the third and final point of what influences your ethical awareness, at least according to our textbook. Is there potential for serious harm? Is there potential for serious harm? If you're engaged in an activity where serious harm might result, most people think twice about getting into that activity. You know, I want to make sure I do it right, etc. I don't want anybody to get hurt. And particularly if it's an unethical thing, if there's a potential for serious harm, oftentimes that makes us think twice about doing something unethical. You know, for example, if you know, some pharmaceutical company can make money by selling a drug that they made cheaply and they cut some corners on, that helps some people but hurts some people, and some people will die from it. When you're hired to be a salesperson to sell that drug for them, you might think twice about selling it because people get hurt from it. So this concept is there potential for serious harm? Well, if there is, generally speaking, people are a little bit more ethically aware. They're a little bit more aware of the situation, so maybe their actions and judgment, etc., will fall in suit. Let me give you an example, though, of where someone tried to use this to do something unethical. If you've ever seen a movie from the 1980s called Wall Street, you would have seen a scene in there involving it. Wall Street, a lot of people have heard of Wolf of Wall Street. This is not the same movie. This was a movie that was made actually, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years before Wolf of Wall Street. And one of the stars in it is Charlie Sheen. Charlie Sheen plays a stockbroker, a young stockbroker on Wall Street. And one of the things he's doing in the movie, at least in the scene I'm going to focus on, is he's talking to a friend of his who's a Wall Street attorney. Also a young fellow who's got his first job or whatever. And he's trying to convince this attorney to do something unethical. He wants the attorney to share some confidential secrets that the attorney has. It's going to help with regard to insider trading and things like that. As Charlie Sheen's character, who is Bud Fox in this movie, as Bud Fox is trying to tell this attorney, I think his name in the movie was Roger, as he's trying to get Roger to do something unethical, one of the things he says to try to convince him to do the unethical action goes in hand in glove with this. He says, hey, Roger, don't worry about it. No one's going to get hurt. No one's going to get hurt. Well, if you don't think there's a potential for serious harm, you might not be as ethically aware with regard to your judgment and your decisions. So he used that to get Roger to do something unethical, which in the movie actually Roger did. So one of the things you want to keep in mind then, if you want to be a good manager, if you want to be a good leader, you want to be a good executive, if you expect your employees to live up to an ethical standard, one of the things you want to do is you want to make sure that they are ethically aware. Again, ethical awareness leads to ethical judgment, which leads to ethical action. So again, try to do things to help them be ethically aware. Well, let's go to the second major topic then for today, and this is called moral disengagement. Moral disengagement. Let me give you a definition of it, and then let me give you some examples of it. I'm actually going to give you 8 examples, but I'm going to put them in 3 sets of them, 3 categories of ways to engage in moral disengagement. Let me first tell you what it means. Moral disengagement, this is defined as turning off your internal control system. Turning off your internal control system and desensitizing your moral radar. Desensitizing your moral radar in order to feel okay about doing something that is unethical. In order to feel okay about doing something that is unethical. Again, let me read through that again. It says, turning off your internal control system and desensitizing your moral radar in order to feel okay about doing something that is unethical. Basically, this goes back to what I said towards the beginning. When your employees cross the line and do something unethical, in most cases, they're not going to say, oh my gosh, I screwed up, it was a bad thing, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. Usually they'll come back to you and they'll have some sort of defense, some sort of reasoning that justifies, at least they think justifies, doing something unethical. What are they doing? Well, they're turning off their internal control system, they're trying to desensitize their moral radar, they're trying to feel okay about doing something that wasn't right, doing something that's unethical. They're trying to get you to feel okay about it as well. And this, again, is called moral disengagement. Certainly a buzz phrase for the class. Well, let's go to the second topic under moral disengagement. And the second topic talks about 8 different ways to turn off your moral radar. 8 different ways to engage in moral disengagement. These 8 ways are put together by your author in 3 sets. So we'll have 3 sets of 8 ways. It's 3 o'clock. So we'll have 3 sets of 8 ways. The first set will have 3, the second set will have 3, and the third set will have 2. 3, 3, and 2 is 8. So let's take a look at these 3 sets and these 8 ways to turn off your moral radar. The first way that we have here to turn off your moral radar, the first of the 3 sets, this is making bad behavior acceptable. Making bad behavior acceptable. And your author gives 3 examples of making bad behavior acceptable. The first example, this is using euphemistic language. Using euphemistic language. And let me just spell the word euphemistic. You probably have heard it, but might not know how to spell it. It's E-U-P-H-E, E-U-P-H-E, M-I-S-T-I-C, M-I-S-T-I-C. And the whole word is E-U-P-H-E, M-I-S-T-I-C, euphemistic language. Let me tell you what euphemistic language is, and then let me give you an example or two to show it. Euphemistic language is where you give a name to something, you label something. The something that you're labeling is bad. It's usually something that was unethical. And you try to give it a really nice name, something that makes it seem a lot less bad. In fact, something that might even make it seem good. So if I take a bad thing and I give it a good name, is that okay? Isn't that making a bad behavior acceptable? Let me give you an example or 2 examples for you. And many examples I'm going to give to you in this lecture are not business examples. They're worldwide historical examples, just because I think, frankly, you can visualize this. You probably heard about this historical fact that happened in the world, etc. You can probably visualize it better than say, oh, if company X did this or company Y did that. So let me give you this example, and it actually involves two words, two uses of euphemistic language. Probably the most unethical person that ever lived in the world, the most unethical leader we've ever had in the world, is probably Adolf Hitler. And if he's not the most, he's close to the most, right? And one of the most unethical activities he engaged in, again, probably the most unethical activity engaged in the history of the world, but again, if not close, is the Holocaust. And in the Holocaust, as you may know, what he did is he basically sent 6 million Jewish people and 2 million others, homosexuals, Catholic priests, others as well, to their deaths, to death camps, where they, in many cases, they were gassed and then their bodies were incinerated in ovens, etc. Horrible thing, right? We're talking men, women, and children, all innocents, etc., all being sent to their death. It was genocide. It was mass murder, etc. It was absolutely horrible. The interesting thing is that Adolf Hitler, in his speeches and in his writings, never called it mass murder, never called it genocide, never even called it the Holocaust. He called it two phrases. He called it the final solution. The final solution. There's a euphemistic phrase. Yeah, it doesn't sound good. Oh, we've got this problem. We're going to solve it. Finally, we're going to solve it. No, it's still mass murder, right? It's still genocide, the final solution. And sending them off to be, mass murdered, gassed and burned, or mass graves when people were shot, other things like that. He called that, instead of mass murder, he called it special treatment. Special treatment. Well, special treatment sounds a heck of a lot better than mass murder. So again, there's an example of euphemistic language. And again, euphemistic language is trying to make bad behavior acceptable, but it doesn't, right? Calling something bad by a good name or a better name still doesn't make it good. It's still a bad thing. Let's take a look at the second example, making bad behavior acceptable. It's called moral justification. Moral justification. What we have in moral justification is people do something unethical, and they usually say there's some greater, being, some God, some act of nature or whatever that had them do it. A good example of this is during the Middle Ages. A lot of the European countries, Christian countries, England, France, I believe Germany, some of the other countries, they sent legions of warriors to the Middle East to conquer the Middle East, to take the Middle East, particularly Jerusalem, to take it back from the people who were living there, who were not Christian, they were Muslim. And how did they justify, killing the men, women, and children? Well, they did it because these people, they didn't believe in our God. They were infidels, and God told us to, go and kill them, etc. We have to help out, our God, etc. And we're going to do that by killing off these other people. Was it right? No, it certainly wasn't right. But again, how did they make it right? They said it was morally justified. God told them to do it. They were doing this to help God because they were stopping the infidels. Let's go to the third example of making bad behavior acceptable. And again, none of these things make it actually acceptable. You're trying to do it. The third and the final example of making bad behavior acceptable is called advantageous comparison. Advantageous comparison. Here, you say, yeah, you know what, I did wrong. I did wrong. But it really wasn't that bad because others do far worse than I do. Others do far worse or did far worse. So, hey, my stuff is okay. Everybody else went out and they stole $20. I only stole 15 cents. So I'm okay, right? That makes it better. And usually it's different than a couple of cents and a couple of dollars or whatever. Usually it's much, much bigger. And a good example of this that we have with regard to advantageous comparison, let's go back to that movie Wall Street with Charlie Sheen, who's playing the character Bud Fox. Bud Fox is still trying to convince his attorney friend, Roger, to do something unethical. One of the things that he says is, hey, listen, Roger, everybody's doing it. In fact, they're doing worse than us. Just give me the information. This is no big deal. Everybody's doing it, and what we're doing is small potatoes compared to what they're doing. Again, trying to convince Roger to do something unethical, trying to make his unethical actions seem like they're okay. Again, making bad behavior acceptable. Do any of these things make it acceptable? No, but that's what people try to do, try to take their bad behavior and try to justify it. So that's the first of the three sets, again, making bad behavior acceptable. Let's go to the second set. The second set of how to turn off your moral radar, the second set of moral disengagement. And this is called distorting outcomes or responsibility. Distorting outcomes or responsibility. And once again, we have three examples here. Again, 3 in the first set, 3 in the second, and 2 in the last, for a total of 8. Let's take a look at the first of these under distorting outcomes or responsibility. The first of these is called displacement of responsibility. Displacement of responsibility. This is where you say, yeah, you know what, I did wrong. What I did, it wasn't good. I shouldn't have done it. However, it's okay. It's acceptable because it's not my fault. Someone else made me do it. And usually in a work setting, my boss made me do it. My boss made me do it. So, yeah, I know it's horrible, etc., but I'm okay with it. Why? Because I didn't make the decision. My boss made me do it. So this is displacement of responsibility. You're saying somebody else was the cause of it. Now, where does this come back to you? Well, as the future boss of these people, the future manager, executive leader of these people, when they do something wrong, oftentimes they're going to blame you. They're going to say, hey, you made me do it, etc. So be careful. Be careful with regard to it. A good example that I've given my classes with this involves a military action that was undertaken by the United States during the Vietnam War. We had a squad, maybe a platoon of soldiers that was fighting, and they were in South Vietnam, and they were fighting the North Vietnamese Army. But in addition to that, they were also fighting guerrilla fighters called the Viet Cong. Now, guerrilla fighters, unlike regular troops or whatever, they don't wear uniforms. They dress just like you and me. They'd wear this or whatever people are wearing in that time period and in that place. So they were fighting, and they went into some village where they're supposed to rescue somebody. And they were told basically the village was cleared. There's no North Vietnamese Army personnel there. You're fine. It should be safe. And they got into this village, and it turned out that the village was filled with the Viet Cong guerrillas, who, again, you couldn't tell them from civilians. They're dressed exactly alike. There's no difference, right? They, after the Americans came in, they opened fire, etc. They kind of ambushed them, etc. And there was a long firefight. And this platoon, finally got out. Fought their way out. And a lot of their members died. A lot of their people got seriously injured. And they finally got out of town. They had the helicopters come in and medevacing out the wounded and the bodies of the deceased, etc. And they thought after this firefight that they'd be going back to their base. Basically, we've been in the stress. Give us an opportunity to relax, etc. Let us go back and kind of lick our wounds, so to speak. Well, instead of that, their boss, some colonel or somebody, someplace on the radio, told them, "Oh no, you can't go back. We want you to go to the next village." And then the next village, we actually know that there's some North Vietnamese guerrillas in there, some Viet Cong guerrillas in there. So what we want you to do is we want you to go into that village, and we want you to clear out the guerrillas. Well, they're tired, they're scared, they're at wits' end, their stress levels up to here, etc. So they go, and when they get into the village, they're surrounded by the villagers, right, men, women, and children, and they know that in that group, not only do we have civilians, but we have these Viet Cong guerrillas, and they don't know one from the other, right? And just after they get into the village, they hear some pops. Sounds like gunfire. So they assume they're under fire, and they pull out their guns. So the army soldiers, our army soldiers, pull out their guns and just start shooting. And they don't know who to shoot because there's no soldiers from their side. There's just all these people around. They don't know who's a guerrilla and who's not. So they basically shot everybody. It was called the My Lai Massacre. The My Lai Massacre. After it was done, and the army found out about it, they court-martialed all the soldiers. You're not supposed to be shooting civilians, etc. They court-martialed the soldiers. And almost to a one, their defense in court was, well, I know it was wrong, I shouldn't have done it, but my boss made me do it. They pointed to the head of their platoon, or Lieutenant Calley, I think his name was. They said, he's the one that said fire, and he's the one that said shoot. He's the one that said do this, that, and the other. And we were just following orders. Well, here's an example of displacement of responsibility. Should you still have done those unethical actions? No. Now, it's a completely different thing, too, in the workplace, right? You're going to be managing a business. You're not going to be at war. There's not going to be people dying, etc. But they're still going to be turning around. They're going to say, I did it because you told me to do it. You ordered me to do it. I did what you told me to do. So be careful about that. Let's go to the next example of distorting outcomes of responsibility. It's called diffusion of responsibility. Diffusion of responsibility. This is where you say, yeah, you know what? I did it. It was wrong. But it wasn't me. It was the whole team, the whole squad, the platoon we did. We all did. It was all part of us, you know. So it wasn't me. It was the whole group of us. Well, when you have that, you know, again, weren't you responsible for doing this? Now, one of the examples I've given my students about this involves actually a football game I went to at Penn State back when I was a student. After the game, it was a big game. I think Penn State was playing Nebraska, and it was one of the early games of the season. Penn State knew it was going to be one of the toughest games on the schedule, and being a first game, it's not good, etc. So we go into this, the stress level's high, and lo and behold, at the very end of the game, Penn State ends up winning. They beat Nebraska. Both teams were in preseason polls ranked really high, like 1, 2, 3, something like that. Penn State ends up winning this game. Everybody goes absolutely nuts, and some students go down, they tear down the goalposts, and they carry one of them downtown. I can still remember that. And they did some other crazy things, but one of the craziest things that I saw is I was walking through the parking lot where they had all the tailgating going on, etc., even after the game, right? People are drinking, and they have hamburgers and all sorts of stuff. As we were leaving, as my family and I were leaving, a couple of yards in front of us, there was an elderly man who was being helped, being carried, etc., by, I think, his wife on one side, who was also kind of elderly, and I think a son on the other side, because there was like snow on the ground or something like that, and they're trying to help him out. And as they're walking through the parking lot, I should add one other thing. The elderly man was dressed in red. Red is the color of Nebraska. So a bunch of these kids who had been drinking and partying, you know, etc., they're running through the parking lot acting like loons, and they saw this person dressed in red, and they charged him. The whole group charged him, but only 2 or 3 of them hit him and knocked this old man right on his face. Again, I'm going to guess this old man, we're probably talking upper 70s, maybe lower 80s, and they knock him right on the ground. And they laugh and they yell at him about wearing red, and you know, horrible words about Nebraska. And then the guys, and it was guys and girls, go running off. Now, the odds are pretty good here that these students normally would not have done that. The odds are pretty good that these students are probably some pretty good people in it. But if we caught them, let's say the police nabbed them and they didn't, you'd know that one of the things they'd say is, well, you know, the only reason I did it, everybody else did it, you know, we all, etc. Well, that's called diffusion of responsibility. You're still responsible. Everybody did it. It doesn't matter everybody did it. You shouldn't have done it. If everybody jumps off a cliff, you shouldn't jump off a cliff. So let's go to the last of distorting outcomes, the third one. And that's called distorting the consequences. Distorting the consequences. This is basically where you say, yeah, you know what I did? I did bad. I shouldn't have done something. It's unethical. I shouldn't have done that. But you know what? It's no big deal. It's no big deal. You know, basically no one got hurt here. No one got injured. It was small potatoes. Yeah, okay, so I did it, but it's no big deal. A good example, this again goes back to that Wall Street movie with Charlie Sheen playing Bud Fox. And you know, again, what we have with Charlie Sheen playing Bud Fox is, you know, telling his attorney friend, hey, no one's going to get hurt. No one's going to get hurt. What we're going to do, no one's even going to notice it. We're going to steal money, etc., but it's not coming out really out of anybody's pockets, etc. We're going to use some insider trading, and we're going to make some money, but no one's losing money. So, I mean, what's the big deal here? You know, again, storing the consequences. It's no big deal. I did wrong, but it's no big deal. You still did wrong. Whether it's a big deal or not, you still did wrong. You shouldn't have done it. You did something unethical. Let's go to the third and final set. Again, the first set was making bad behavior acceptable. The second, distorting outcomes or responsibilities. Let's go to the third set. This is reducing the worthiness of the victim. Reducing the worthiness of the victim. And the author looks at two different examples here. The first is called dehumanization. It's the word human in the middle, dehumanization. And basically what you're doing is you're doing something unethical to a human being, but you're basically saying, no, that's not a human being. That person's a dog, that person's a pig, that person's not human. Well, if they're not human, then isn't it okay if I treat them unethically? Oh, I know I treat humans ethically, but they're not human. They're a dog, they're a pig, whatever it might be, and you can think of other names that I won't use in the video here that they'll call them. So if they're an animal, I can treat them worse than I treat a person, right? Well, probably you shouldn't be treating animals bad either, but nonetheless, at least that's the justification that you have here. An example I have for you, again, goes back to the Holocaust. And one of the things that we saw that a lot of people, not just Adolf Hitler, but a lot of the people in the Nazis and the German army, the German people, that all in some way or another participated in the Holocaust. Most of them, took a blind eye and, looked other ways as these horrible things were going on. And in that sense, you're kind of participating too. Well, one of the justifications was they said that the Jews, particularly the ones that they focused the Holocaust on, they called them in a German word, Untermensch, which is Untermensch, 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 which means below people, which means they were subhuman. Well, we can treat them badly, right? Because they're not human, they're subhuman. Of course they were human. But somehow you try to justify this horrible action against them because they weren't human. Let's go to the second example of reducing the worthiness of the victim. And what we have there is called attribution of blame. Attribution of blame. This is where you say, hey, you know what? I did do wrong. I shouldn't have done it. I did do wrong, but they deserved it. They deserved it. You made your bed, you sleep in it, they deserved it. Paybacks are hell, they deserved it. Another example, go back to, and I guess this will be my last example with Hitler and the Holocaust. Before Hitler came to power, he was in jail. He had been jailed for a riot, military coup or whatever. And what we ended up seeing in that is Hitler ended up going to jail, and he wrote a book called Mein Kampf. And in Mein Kampf, he put together his plans of Germany, including this final solution that he talked about. And he said, you know what? These people, these Jews, they deserve it because, according to him, wrongly of course, but according to him, Germany lost World War I because of the Jewish people. The Jewish people, he said, were in charge of the government, the finances, etc. in Germany during World War I, and they were the ones who pulled out or didn't do something or whatever, and we lost the war because of it. Well, that's hogwash. That's not what happened. But he was using this to blame them. So again, attribution of blame. I can treat you poorly because you deserved it. In most cases, people don't deserve it. But nonetheless, that's what people will say, will try to do with regard to that. Let's now move on to the next major topic, which is barriers to good ethical judgment. Barriers to good ethical judgment. Okay, now with regard to barriers to good ethical judgment, there are basically 2 points that the author makes. So let's take a look at those 2 points. The first, he says that you have what are called barriers to gathering the facts. And the second is you have barriers regarding considering the consequences. So again, the first, barriers to gathering the facts, and the second, barriers to considering the consequences. So let's take a look at each of those, and let's see what your author has to say about that. With regard to barriers to gathering the facts, one of the first things that your author talks about is he says one of the barriers is overconfidence. Overconfidence. I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but when you're confident about doing something, perhaps you've done it before, you have proven to yourself you can do something, oftentimes you become very confident, right? Well, when you get to the point that you're overconfident, what tends to happen is you tend not to spend as much time in preparation. You tend to do less research. Now, I want you to think about this. Most people who are in business and have been successful and have risen through the ranks and moved to the tops of their corporations, the so-called E-suite, etc. Most of those people have been successful, right? So most of those people are pretty confident. Well, one of the problems you have is oftentimes people who are confident or overly confident, they don't spend much time looking at the facts. They know how to do things. Why should I look at the facts? I know how to do this. And there's a movie that we've talked about in class before, and I think it's an excellent movie with regard to business. And it's called Pirates of the Silicon Valley. Pirates of the Silicon Valley, which is a movie about how Steve Jobs started Apple and how Bill Gates started Microsoft. And in that movie, the person who's playing the character of Bill Gates says something that goes along this line. He says, "Success is a menace. Success is a menace that fools smart people into thinking they can do no wrong." Success is a menace that fools smart people into thinking they can do no wrong. That is part of this barrier to gathering facts. If you are overconfident, if you don't think you can do wrong, you're probably not going to spend as much time looking into the facts as if this is one of the first times you're doing it. You're trying to figure out what to do, at which time you're probably looking at lots of facts and trying to figure out what to do. Well, if you want to have good ethical judgment, it's probably a good idea to know what the facts are. Probably want to gather the facts. Be careful about this barrier called overconfidence. Let's take a look at the second overconfidence barrier that we have. Second barrier to gathering the facts, and this is called the confirmation trap. The confirmation trap. And what this is unlike before where you don't really look at much information, you're overconfident, so why do I have to gather facts? Here you actually do gather facts. You do look for them. But when doing so, you have a selective memory or do selective choosing. You pick those facts that support whatever decision you plan to make in the first place. So you're selectively picking them. Those facts that don't fit, oh, I want to do X, and those facts tell you, oh, I shouldn't do that, you kind of push aside. You discredit them. You know, the study is old, the study wasn't right, the study was done by these people, and they have this bias or that bias. So what you end up doing is you just look for facts that confirm that what you plan to do is okay, which is bad, particularly if what you plan to do is unethical. So that's the first of the barriers to good ethical judgment, barriers to gathering the facts. Let's go to the second. Barriers regarding considering the consequences. Barriers regarding considering the consequences. And your textbook has 4 examples of these. The first is only considering a few consequences of the many. Only considering a few consequences of the many. Let's face it, most of the actions we take in this day and age have multiple consequences. You do one thing and you're focusing primarily on that one thing, coming up with consequence X, but in addition to X, it has consequences A, B, and C, and G, F, and Q, etc., and whatever. Well, one of the barriers to considering the consequences is only considering a few of the consequences of the many. Oh yeah, I know there's going to be 10 different things that are going to happen here, but let's look at these 1 or 2. These are the ones that we want to focus on, and of course, those are the ones that confirm that your decision to do something, particularly something unethical, is a good decision. No, you don't want to do that. So that's the first of these barriers, considering consequences. Let's take a look at the second. The second is having a bias, often unrecognized, to consider primarily the consequences for you or those close to you. Having a bias, often unrecognized, to consider primarily the consequences for you or those close to you. The insiders. One of the things that we tend to see in a lot of companies that have engaged in unethical activities is we see that not only did the top decision maker get something out of it, the unethical activity benefited the top decision maker, it oftentimes benefits the insiders, those that are close to that top person. Let me give you an example here, and it's not so much an unethical thing here, but it again goes to show you this bias that we have. Think, for example, if you were driving in a city in Europe, one of the older cities, and you're in one of the downtown sections that was built in medieval ages or whatever and barely fits a cart and a horse down it, etc. So you're on this road in this city, etc., and it's really, really narrow. And there's buildings on both sides. And let's say you're going downhill. And as you're going downhill, you can see at the end of the block, there's a traffic light and there's an intersection. And the traffic light turns red. And you can see people already starting to cross the street from both sides, right? So you go and you apply the brakes. Let's say that the brakes don't work, and you're hitting, the brakes don't work, etc. It's a rental car, no one checked the brakes or whatever. And now you're careening down this, and you're just going faster and faster. And there's no way to stop from hitting the people that are starting to cross into the road. Let's say that on the left-hand side of the road, well, I guess it'd be this hand for me. On the left-hand side of the road, let's say there are 5 school children, young school children, second, third graders or whatever, on their way to school. So, we're talking, what, kids 9 years old or something like that, 8, 9 years old or whatever, and they're starting to walk across the street. And let's say on the other side of the road, there's only 2 people. There's only 2 people. And those people are your parents. So now you're careening down the road. You know you're going to hit somebody. But the road is wide enough that you can do one of 3 things. You can go right down the middle and literally take out everybody. Kill, all 7 people, the 5 kids and your parents. Or you can veer to the left and you can take out the 5 kids but save your parents. Or you can veer to the right and take out your 2 parents and save the 5 kids. Think about it. How many of you, well, first off, how many are going right down the middle and get everybody? Probably nobody. Hopefully nobody would. So now you make a decision, do I take out my 2 parents or do I take out the 5 kids I don't know? How many of you are going to take out the parents? I'm sorry, take out the kids. Because you know the parents. You want to benefit the parents. So one of the problems you have is there's this bias, often unrecognized in all of us, not only to look at consequences that affect us, but also affect those that are close to us. And in business, those tend to be the insiders, not so much your parents or whatever, but the insiders, those other people who are top in the organization that you're working with, your buddies, so to speak, or whatever. So you got to be careful about that, because of your bias, you're not going to consider necessarily the consequences for everybody, but mainly the consequences for me and my top group of people. Let's go to the third barrier regarding considering the consequences. This is ignoring the consequences that affect only a few as opposed to the many. Ignoring the consequences that affect only a few as opposed to the many. There's something called majority tyranny, and this is where the majority makes all the decisions and the minority usually suffers because of it. A good example of this in the United States goes with regard to our educational system up to about 1954, and even afterwards for probably a couple of decades. But up to 1954, the law of the land said that if you were white, you would go to these schools. But if you were a person of color, generally someone who was black, you had to go to these schools. And clearly, the schools for the whites were always better than the schools for the blacks. And what they said in the United States, the majority of people said this, and they voted for electors and congressmen and women and senators and whatever, and presidents or whatever, that all came out and said, hey, yeah, listen, that's fine. The majority has spoken because that's going to help the majority of people go to a better school. Well, in making that decision, of course, they're not looking at the impact on a few, they're looking at the impact on a many. And generally speaking, in ethics, we oftentimes do that, but sometimes it's wrong. Sometimes we have this majority tyranny. Think about it. Was it right to send just black students, who were a minority of people, right, to bad schools? Of course not. So what we ended up seeing here is, people in the United States up through 1954, when the Supreme Court said, that's stupid, we're not going to do it, it's illegal and unethical, etc. We were basically looking at the consequences, for the many as opposed to the few. You should be looking at both, right? I mean, when you make a decision, you're going to impact a lot of people, both negatively and positively. In making a decision, look at everybody, not just one group or another, and particularly, don't just look at the many, also look at the few. That might have a big impact. In fact, I think there was even a movie, a Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise, where at the end of that they were talking about something like that. Well, let's go to the fourth and the final barrier to considering consequences, and this is underestimating the risk. Underestimating the risk And your book gives you two examples of this. The first is sometimes you're just too optimistic. There's a risk of a negative thing happening, but you're basically saying it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. I'm looking and I've judged, etc. But you're underestimating. Let me give you a good example. That goes back to Bud Fox and Charlie Sheen in that movie Wall Street, as he's trying again to convince Roger, the attorney friend, to do this unethical activity. One of the things Bud Fox says to him is, "Hey, listen, the Securities and Exchange Commission is always investigating my boss. He's doing far worse than you and I, and they're always investigating him, and nothing ever happens. They never go after him. They investigate and they just let it go. They never send him in jail or whatever. So with regard to you and I, don't worry about it. The SEC is not going to do anything. Nothing's ever going to happen to you and I." Well, of course, towards the end of the movie, we find out otherwise. The SEC indeed does go after them. Let's go to the last example of underestimating the risk. And this is having an illusion that you have more control than you do. Having an illusion that you have more control than you do. Let me tell you what that means. Let's say that you go up to one of your employees and you say to your employee, "Hey, listen, the numbers for last year were horrible, and I don't want to report those numbers because if we do, not only might I lose my job, you might lose your job, but other people are going to get laid off. There's going to be all horrible consequences here. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to fudge the books, change this number, etc. Just a little, not much, just a little, just so everything's a little bit better here." And your employee said, "Oh my gosh, I can't do that. They'll send me to jail or whatever." And you go back to your employee and say, "Listen, I'll never let that happen. I'm in control of this thing. I'll protect you. You'll never get into trouble or whatever with regard to that." Can you do that? Probably not. So what you end up doing is you have this illusion, I'm in so much control. Hey, this is no bad thing will happen. I'm in control. Well, the trouble is, you're not in control. As much as you think you're in control, you're not. There's always others that have more control than you do. And hopefully, if you've done something wrong, hopefully others will have more control than you and eventually be able to catch up to you. So be careful about this. Underestimating risk is another barrier regarding considering the consequences. Well, that finishes up the third major topic under this chapter. Let's go to the fourth and the final one for today. It's called Other Considerations. Other Considerations. And there are basically four that the textbook lists under Other Considerations. And the first of these is beware not to think of yourself as being superior or the true moral compass. Beware not to think of yourself as being superior or the true moral compass. I mean, basically what we have here is so many people have such a huge ego that they think that whatever they do is always right. They always know the right answer, etc. So, hey, I don't have to look at the facts. I don't have to do anything. That confidence thing we talked about earlier. Hey, listen, I know this, and everybody, everybody should act just like me, because I'm the best. I would never do this, that, and the other. Well, those are oftentimes the people that end up getting in trouble because, indeed, while maybe they generally don't do something bad, their ego oftentimes takes them off track and they do something bad, or their ego blinds them, puts on blinders to them, blinds them to things that are actually going on with their employees and their company, and then they have trouble with it. So let's go to the second other consideration. Be careful of using only gut reactions. Be careful of using only gut reactions. Thinking's not bad. Thinking's not bad. So often in business, we don't have time to think through a whole lot of things, and we make gut reactions. It's amazing how oftentimes those gut reactions, when we later think about them, it's like, oh my God, what did I do? How did I do this, etc. It was urgency and stress. I had to make a decision, but oh my gosh, if I had thought about this or thought about that, oftentimes you can see yourself making an unethical decision because of the fact that, basically you made a gut reaction. Gut reactions are not necessarily always bad, but be careful. Gut reactions don't think of ethics too often. So you want to be careful about that. Let's go to the third other consideration. You want to recognize that unconscious biases do exist even in good people, even in you. Unconscious biases do exist even in good people, even you. You might have remembered the story I told you in an earlier class where I was teaching at the University of Pittsburgh, and I had an MBA class, and some of the students in the MBA class, this particular term, were visiting from Germany. There was some sort of partnership between Pitt and a university over in Germany. I think it was in Bavaria, I'm not sure. And they'd have a student exchange, and we had a number of students that came over from Germany that were in this class. It was great. I really loved the fact that they were there, etc., and the different insight and outlooks that they had, and they could share. The diversity was wonderful. But one of the problems that I ran into was that thing of ethnocentrism, which I talked about. I gave everybody a quiz, and in the United States, we know that when you have a quiz, unless a professor tells you otherwise, you're not supposed to be talking to the person next to you, right? It's quiet, you're answering, etc. in class. And I gave this quiz, and I saw over on the left of me, I saw the 5 or 6 German students that were there were talking to one another. And they looked quite confused. They looked stressed. And I'm not sure why they were talking to one another. I'm thinking, well, maybe in Germany they have group exams or something. And I kind of looked over at them and gave them one of those looks to, don't do that, etc. And then a few minutes later, they're still talking. And one of them comes up to me and he's held up the exam. He said, we're all confused. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, question number 1, it says something like, and of course the question isn't this, I'll make an easy question, the sky is blue, T/F. And basically I'm saying true or false, the sky is blue, true or false. He said, in Germany, we don't know, what does T/F mean? Apparently in Germany, if it was true or false, using the German words as opposed to American words, they'd write out true, false. They didn't write T/F. He had no idea. So I mean, think about that. Here in this particular class, I had no intention of discriminating against those German students or treating them in any poor way. I had no intention of being ethnocentric. But here it was. There was this unconscious bias I have. Oh, yeah, everybody knows what T/F is. Well, no, they don't. So again, be careful. Unconscious biases do exist even in good people. Even if you're a good person, and I hope that you are, there's probably an unconscious bias or two resting inside you, probably a lot. And sometimes you'll default to that. And then let's go to the fourth and the final of the consideration. You want to be careful of 2 different things. Script processing, and cost-benefit analyses. Be careful of script processing and cost-benefit analyses. Let me tell you what those are. Script processing is when you go on to autopilot. You've desensitized yourself, etc., and you do something the same all the time. You never think about it, and work every day is the same, so you're always doing this the same way. And because you never think about it, you never really look about it, you're on autopilot. This is called script processing. You have a script in your mind. This is how things go. And the trouble is, while you're on autopilot, other things are happening. Let me give you an example here. How many of you, when you would commute back and forth to school, work, wherever, and you did this every day, right? In the morning you went in, and the afternoon, evening you came back out, and you rode the same bus both ways, or your parents drove you, or you drove you, or whatever. How many of you, let's say you were driving, how many of you go, get in the car, start it up, you start to drive, and the next thing you know, you're driving into the parking lot at work. You can't remember half the stuff that went on from the beginning to the end. Well, why? You were driving on autopilot. So did you recognize anything as you're going through? Well, if a car pulled in front of you, you'd probably wake up out of autopilot. But as you were driving in, did you recognize halfway through there that, over on the side, they're building a new Burger King? No, you didn't look at it. Or over on this side, they're painting some red building blue or something. You probably didn't notice it. Why? You're on autopilot. Well, if you don't notice things like that, if you start to work and get to work and don't know what happened in between, you don't see things. And if you are on autopilot at work, if you're doing script processing at work, there's a good chance that you as a leader won't be looking for those things where the employees are actually doing something wrong, where all of a sudden they're doing something unethical. Be careful about script processing. Be careful about being on autopilot. In the other example here I mentioned, be careful of script processing and cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is where you make decisions based only basically on money. Oh, we can save money here, we can save money there. Sometimes those decisions, although they make sound financial decisions or sound financial advice, it's good, sometimes they're unethical. Let me give you an example. Most of you might have seen a movie, hopefully you saw a movie, called Christmas Vacation with Chevy Chase. And in this movie, Christmas Vacation, Chevy Chase, the star of it, he plays an account executive for a company that does something with cereal or something like that. And his boss, every year, since the time Chevy was hired, and Chevy's been there for, I don't know, 13 years or whatever, every year for every employee, his boss would give you a Christmas bonus, a holiday bonus. And it was a fairly substantial amount every year, and it probably went up over the years or whatever. And this one particular year that the movie was made, Chevy, based upon the fact that he thought he was going to be getting his normal Christmas bonus, went out and took the money he would have gotten, and he purchased an in-ground pool to be built in his yard or something like that, which is a considerable amount of money that he spent, but it was okay because, right, every year we get the bonus. Well, in the movie, in that particular year, his boss canceled the bonuses. Well, at the end of the movie, his boss is being yelled at by Chevy and his family and whatever. And the boss comes out and he says, well, you know, sometimes something that looks good on paper, sometimes when the numbers look good, when you really consider that real people are involved, you might make a different decision. I shouldn't have canceled the bonuses. Well, that's what we're talking about here with regard to be careful of cost-benefit analysis. Sometimes the numbers are really good, but sometimes they lead you to doing something that's unethical. So you want to be careful about that. Well, that concludes our lecture on ethics. Again, we're focusing primarily on you being a leader, you being a manager, executive in business. What are you going to do with regard to your employees? How are you going to manage them? And if you have an idea of, the rule about, awareness and judgment and actions, that might help you. If you have an idea, my employees are going to come up with all these excuses for doing bad things and try to make it look like they did a good thing, or if you know what those are, hopefully you're going to be able to manage them better. Looking at, the barriers to ethical judgment, hopefully it'll help you to overcome those barriers because you want to be ethical as you make decisions. And some of these other considerations too. You want to look at them. You want to make sure that you are ethical. We all make mistakes. We all do something that's unethical. Hopefully it doesn't happen a lot. Hopefully it doesn't have much of an impact on people, but we can all become better. And as you become a leader in a business, etc., that we have, what you're going to end up wanting to do is you're going to want to figure out, how can I manage my employees to really help them to act ethically, to follow my ethical standards. Hopefully what we talked about today might help you. Hope you had a good class. Hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, let me know. Everybody else, I'll see you later. Good night, everybody.